Hey there, welcome back. Part two of importing, setting up a sync between your Bubble database and your Xano database. Now, in this session, we're going to run through essentially how to set up a relationship and maintain a relationship between your Bubble database and Xano. And this is referencing part one. So if you haven't checked out part one, make sure you do because we're working on the same function. Essentially, what we got set up was we had our sync set up to ingest all 100 records from our response. And we're using the get pathway to make sure that these items are working. In this instance, we now need to set up some relationships that were existing. And we're going to start with the company relationship and the deal relationship that was already set up within our Bubble database. It's this company and the deal relationship we see here. Now, in order to set up a relationship in Xano, firstly, inside of our customers table, we do have these relationships. You'll see we've got a table relationship set up where we have a company ID and we have a relationship where we have a deal ID. We also have a list of deals down here as well, which I'll show you how to set up a little bit later on as well. But essentially, inside of these tables is a relationship I've created, which does reference another table. And you do this inside of, when creating the relationships, you'll just simply reference these items. And the way that Xano works in terms of relationships is in order to reference an ID, you need to reference, an ID of a particular record. So I can type in and have a look at the IDs here. But essentially, if I look at companies, if I'm to add a company to the database, I need to reference the ID that exists within this record. So to add the second record to my customers table, when I'm working in the function stack, I'll be referencing ID2 as the item to add as a relationship in our tables. If that doesn't make sense, bear with me. So jumping back into our function, what we have is essentially a response received. And I'm just going to bring this up first to show essentially what information we're working with from the external API and how we go about setting this up. So if I run this, we're looking at the individual customer or each record that exists. We're looking at all the records actually that exists right now. And we can see here that the relationship we're currently receiving from Bubble is the unique identifier of that record. So just like Xano, it's using its own unique identifier as the ID to maintain the relationship between these records. So we're going to need to use these to be able to essentially find the relationships. And we can do this by, first, we need to check that these records exist. And if they do exist, we need to return the Xano ID to essentially create the relationship inside of our table. And how I'm doing this is essentially inside of the loop where we've got the customers, instead of first adding our customers this time, we're going to instead add an item to our company table and to our deals table first to see if these records exist. And if they do exist, I'm going to return the Xano ID, which allows me to then add this item into my add record step and maintain that relationship. So how I'm doing this is essentially inside of our for each loop, I've created a group, which is essentially going to be doing all the conditional work. And we only want to really add a record if a relationship exists. Because like we noticed in our last scenario, not every single record actually contains a relationship to a company and to a deal. So we need to firstly allow for a situation where a record doesn't exist. Like we learned before, we can do that by trying to find a pathway inside of the results. And we're using the get filter to do this to essentially allow for the circumstances where one doesn't exist. So what we're doing in this circumstance is same like we did for adding records. We're first using the variable customer, which is the single record within our loop. And when they're getting the company, which is a path within that result, and if it doesn't exist, we're returning null value. And instead in this circumstance, because we're setting up a conditional, we're saying if the company does not equal null, then we want it to do something. So if the record isn't null, what we then want to do is we want to add the record to our company table. And what we'll be using is essentially the Bubble ID that we've received here in the company section. as the unique identifier of how we're trying to search for that record inside of an add or edit record step in our companies table. So what's happening here is essentially we're adding the record from company 1, and the output that we receive from this is the result. So if we have a look here, I can now reference again the previous variable created from an add or edit record step, and it's giving me the result. So I can then reference company1.id is giving me the Xano ID of the company record inside of the Xano database. So I can use this as an identifier to create my relationship inside of Xano later on. So if it's a bit confusing, bear with me and I'll sort of run through how it works. Now, because we're using a conditional step here, this is the then or an else. So assuming that the record does not equal null, it's going to add the record into the database, which is perfect. But if the record doesn't exist, so there isn't a company relationship within this record, instead what we're going to do is else. So if it doesn't exist, we're also going to create an output, which is the company Xano ID. And you'll note these have the exact same variable ID or variable name. That's done intentionally. And we see here the value for this one in the else is nothing, because if the record doesn't exist, then we want to create the ID as it doesn't exist because there's no relationship to add. By doing this and creating a then or else, only one of these pathways is going to be met per run because it's either true or it's false. And based on that, what that then means is when we do an add or edit record step into our customer database, we can simply reference the company's Xano ID because both whether it exists or it doesn't exist, this variable is being created, if that makes sense, within our original response. So we can then use the same logic. What's happening is if the customer ID or unique identifier exists, it's adding a record. We then receive the Xano ID, which we can then add to our customer table. And we want to do the same also for our deals. So if the deal exists, which same thing, customer get the deal relationship, which is the pathway we got in the response. If it doesn't equal null, meaning there is a record that exists, we're going to add that record into our deal table. And we're going to return the deal Xano ID, which is again just deal.id, deal1, which is the output.id. And the variable again is empty if it doesn't exist. And that's it. That's the relationships now created. So if we run this, essentially what will happen is it will make sure I got no stop and debug, so remove this one. It will now go through, if I set it up correctly, it will add the relationships. 704 statements. So you'll now see that it's ran through, it's updated those items. And if we head into our database now, we've now got the company ID and the deal ID added as relationships to our customer record. So essentially, that's our relationships created. We've created a conditional, which is checking to see if the record exists. And if it does exist, we're adding that record to our company table or our deals table. We're getting the ID back from that creation. And add or edit record, because I've only got the bubble ID selected and there's no other values, all it will do, it will just update that ID to the same value. So it's not changing any records. It's not going to update anything or delete anything unless we add some additional values here. We've now got that relationship in place. So that's solved one of the issues, dealing with a relationship. What we also want to do now is deal with pagination as well. So because we received 120 responses from Bubble, we actually wanted to access all 120 records. So how could we set up an autonomous system to automatically, I guess, count and keep track of how many records it needs to bring across? So we noticed before we used a for each loop, and that was great because we wanted to run through all the records. But now instead we're going to use a different loop. This is a while loop. And a while loop works off when basically a condition being true or false. While the condition's maintained, it will continue to run. So getting into some more advanced logic, how we've set this up here is we need to firstly know when are we running or why are we running through these items. And how we're actually able to get that information is if we check here and we're getting our, essentially our customer's API is the first bit of information we want. So this is going back to the original Bubble response. And as a raw result, we're seeing what we're receiving here is the response. We're getting cursor 0, and cursor is essentially the position of the records. 0 means it's the first record that exists within your bubble database. And we can see at the very bottom here, we have remaining. So how many items were remaining? And what we've done is outside of our loop, our while loop, which I've added in here, we've got firstly a variable that I've set up called pagination continue, and the value is true. And this is what our loop is working off. So if pagination continue equals true, we want our while loop to continue. I've also got here our cursor count as well, which is just a variable I've created to essentially know where we want our position to be. Because after we run through the first 100 records, we want our cursor position to be 100 to essentially then give us our next list of 100 records. So what we're doing is essentially same as before. We've added all of our logic that was there before now into a while loop. And we're saying while the pagination continues variable is true, we're going to continue to run through and loop through this customer request API. And we're going to call it multiple times until this condition is set to false. So what we're doing here is, now that we've gotten the customer API data, we're essentially setting up this section, which is the customers or the remaining count. So if I stop and debug, we'll see that value that we had before was 20. So there's 20 records remaining. If we go down a little bit further, at the very bottom of my function stack, I've added some conditions. So each time we get to the bottom of the loop, I'm essentially adding a count onto my cursor count, which is the initial position we're accessing. And inside of my API, you'll see that we now have a new section added into here. So I've gone back to hard coding URL here to contain the customer. And then what we see here is the params. And the params is essentially the body, another way of putting it in your APIs. And you'll see at the very base here, by default, your params are always going to be an object. And an object is going to contain your key value pairs. So you can easily set a path. If you wanted to set the object to name, and you wanted the person's name to be John, you've now created essentially the key value being name, and the value now being John. But in this instance, we're using cursor and cursor count. And we're able to then essentially set the cursor count, which is, again, detailed inside of their documentation. You can partially find this information if you look for it. Essentially, the cursor count is going to let us know what position to search within the API. And when it runs its first loop, it's then going to add 100 to the base value of 0. So we're going to have 100 will be our cursor count, meaning that it's going to return every value beyond that for the next 100. What we're also doing, though, is we're checking to see if the remaining record count equals 0. Now, in the first instance, when it runs through it, the remaining record count is going to be 20. So this condition is not going to be met to true because we're going to see that the remaining record count equals 0. Then we want to update the variable pagination continue to be false. So essentially what we're doing now is we've created a mechanism which we've contained all our other logic within, which is while this is set to true, and it's going to continue to run. So by checking the remaining record count at the base here, essentially what this is doing is allowing us to identify when it gets to no records left. And then when this happens, we set the value to be false, essentially stopping the function from running. But by doing this, we can now essentially run through all the records. And we should, once this completes, have more than 100 records. We should have 120 records. That's now complete. So it's done all 857 statements. And if we check our database again, we've gone from having 101 records down here to 121 records. Okay, and the last one we get into is a list of relationships. So as you can see here in the response I've received from the Bubble API, inside of this record, I've got a list of deals. And a list of deals is essentially a list of relationships. And the way that Bubble's maintaining the relationship is it's providing the record ID for each of the items within the list of deals. And simply, this is just a relationship, which is a list of deals set up in my bubble DB. So to essentially work through this, just like we did for our other items, I'm just going to remove that stop and debug. And for our other items, what we're doing is essentially we're needing to create a conditional. And we're saying if list of deals exists and it does not equal null, then essentially we want to create access the deals table. And we're going to add all three of these deals or edit them if they already exist. And each time this happens, we're going to get the Xano ID from the record creation process. And we're going to add this Xano ID to the array that we need to essentially construct. And if this deal was deal 1, and this was deal 2, and this was deal 3 in Xano, the Xano ID is going to be 1, 2, 3. So our array, which we're going to add into our database, is going to be identical to list of deals, except it's instead going to have the Xano ID as opposed to the bubble ID. So in our check, we're checking to see if customers list of deals equals null. And if it doesn't equal null, we're then going to first create an array. The reason we're creating this array is each time we loop through an item, we're going to add onto the end of this array the ID or the Xano ID for each deal. And if we stop and debug to kind of see what's happening here is we're essentially running through this customer.list of deals. And I can use dot notation here because I've already checked to see if it exists as part of this conditional. So if I run this, what this is going to return is just the individual list of deals. So the individual deal ID, which is being returned as deals item. Inside of my add or record step, again, we're checking based on the bubble ID, which is a field that's already been set up, or a column that's already been set up in my Xano DB. And I'm adding the deals item, which is just this bubble's unique identifier, as the record that the field that I'm searching by. So it's saying if this bubble ID already exists, it's going to just essentially return what this record is. And the output I'm going to receive is the ID, which is the Xano ID that I need. So how I'm then accessing that is deal 1. The result of that, I'm getting the ID. And then I'm using the add to end of array function, which is I'm referencing the array that I created outside of the loop, which is quite important. We need to make sure that this exists prior to looping through these items because we're going to need to make sure we can access this array to essentially add to our database. So each time we run through the list of bubble IDs, it's taking the ID, searching the deals table to see if it exists. And if it doesn't exist, it's going to add it. If it already exists, it's going to return the value that already exists. And we're going to access the ID from that value and add it to our array. If it loops through this 3 times, by the end of it, we're going to have 3 IDs added to our deals array. And same thing, if the value doesn't exist, I'm still going to have an array, but this is going to be an empty value because essentially there isn't any items to add for this particular record. So once we've essentially created our array of IDs, we can then just add this to our customer's record, which if we look at the deals ID, deals list, we're just simply adding in that deals array variable, which is also just an array that we're adding. So if I run this, I get rid of the stop and debug. This should be our final step required to ensure that we have all of our relationships now set up in our database. And we're now complete. So we can see all the items have been added. And if we head to our database, we should be able to see in our customers, and we head across to where we have our deals list, you can now see that the relationship of all the deals now still exists in our customer. So we've gone through how to connect to the Bubble API, how to set up a basic sync, and then how to set up a more complicated sync to essentially be able to deal with pagination and to deal with relationships. And now the last step we're going to do to essentially create a sync between Bubble and Xano is we're going to add our function we've now created into our task. And this is what I mentioned earlier at the start of the first video, that we'd be using a function, as this is a reusable piece of logic that you can insert into autonomously syncing tasks, or you can also trigger these functions via an API if you add it to an API. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to head to the task section, and you do need a paid account to access tasks. And essentially what we're going to do is we're going to create a bubble customer sync. And as we created a function, so a task is essentially going to allow us to routinely run a process. And you'll see at the base here, we've got timing and a section where we can include the function above. And you'll notice that for a task, there isn't any inputs. The reason for that is a task cannot be externally triggered. A task must be set based on a routine, which is what we control via timing here. So for this type of sync, it's something that, let's say, for example, we're just looking to start to migrate our data across from Bubble. We only want to migrate this once every 24 hours. We just want to keep it in sync. So we want this to be a repeating process, and we want it to repeat every day. And we can choose when this starts. So it's currently 5 a.m. for me, so I might get it to start tomorrow at 5:30 in the morning. And I'm going to save this. And inside the function stack, we have this section for custom functions, which is, whether in an API or a task, gives you access to all of these functions that we've created throughout this import scenario. This is my complete function here. And that's it. Now that I've got this set, I can publish these changes and I can enable the task. And this task will now run every 24 hours and essentially sync, keep the Bubble database in sync with Xano. Thanks for following along. I hope this has been useful. Please, if you noticed something or you weren't quite clear on something that I've covered in this video, please leave me a comment in the section below, and we'll aim to get back to you as quick as possible. If there's something you think you could do to improve this as well, also please include in the comments as well. We'd love to hear from you. I'm not an expert at everything, and I'd love to hear some feedback otherwise as to how you could help the community better and to give some advice for other users. But, thanks for watching.